Let's transition to the next phase, and after that, we'll take questions, inshallah. And again, if the questions come, you just write them down and pass them up from the sisters and the brother side. So now the journey itself begins. Now, the flight can take time. The average travel time anywhere between, the total travel time will usually be at least 18 hours, up to maybe 24 hours total travel time. And if you include travel time door to door, that could be up to around 30 or sometimes 40 hours or so. So it's a relatively long time. What do we do on the flight, right? And this is important because I think we sometimes think about the flight as this is just another trip for me, right? Meaning this trip that I'm now taking to the Haram, this is not a business trip to Europe or a vacation to California. This is actually a very special flight, right? So I'm going to give a few recommendations here. The first is that we should rest. And the rest here means with the intention of rejuvenating ourselves. It's been a long point, and now we finally come to this stage. And if we need to rest up in preparation for the rest of the trip, this is our opportunity to be able to do so. The second recommendation is that we should review rules and plan for Umrah. What do I mean by this? Right? This is a nice opportunity for us to take out our Umrah book and quickly refresh the rules because this is downtime. And plan for Umrah, what I mean by this, and I'm going to mention this a little bit later, is that we should all have a little notebook with us, a little sort of a pocket notebook with us, and we should use this to jot things down for the trip itself. And I'm going to give you examples of how you can use something like this on the trip. But this is an opportunity, the flight, for us to prepare. When I'm doing tawaf, what exactly do I plan to recite and plan to do? When I'm doing sa'i, what exactly am I planning to do? This form of ibadah can take 3-4 hours. I can't just be thinking about anything during that time. So this is an opportunity for us to be able to plan for this. The third is to engage in dhikr, recitation of the Quran, and nawafil, because now we're on this journey toward Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I mentioned nawafil in particular, which is an optional prayer, because the Prophet ﷺ used to pray his supererogatory prayers in any direction while seated. So although the fard prayers require a person to stand, the optional prayers don't, and they don't even require facing the qibla. So we could literally be doing 2 or 3 hours of just nafil prayer sitting on the plane if we'd like. And we'll be fully rewarded, and this will help us and allow us to prepare. The final thing, I think this is the most important thing I want to highlight for the flight itself, is to reflect. And what I mean by reflect here is, look, up until this point, there's been the stress of packing, the stress of preparation, the stress of getting to the airport, the stress of going through security, the stress of getting on the plane. This is now, once we're on the plane, this is now a new milestone for us. We've now achieved a particular milestone. And we should begin to think, like, what's happening to me right now? What's happening to me right now? I'm literally being taken from my home or from my city on this flight toward Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's home. And it's very powerful. If we think about it, it's as if Allah ta'ala is pulling us toward His home. Historically, people would travel on foot or by camel very slowly toward the Haram. And yet I'm sitting on this plane, and Allah Ta'ala is pulling me at a speed of 500 or 550 miles an hour so I can get to His home. And what's incredible is that I'm now stuck on this plane. Me, the undeserving person who hasn't performed a single deed worthy of this. And there are people who are far more deserving of making this journey. If it was up to me, I would probably get up and turn around and walk in the other direction, because the rest of my life has been spent turning away from Allah. And now He's locked me into this plane, and I'm being pulled at extremely fast speeds toward His home, because this is the only way in which I will actually get there. I'm being pulled toward the house of Allah Ta'ala, that even if I wanted to turn back now, I couldn't. That's how extreme Allah Ta'ala's mercy is. Even if I wanted to turn around, I wouldn't be able to. The plane is already heading in this direction. He's calling me toward His home. And of all people, He's calling me. There are people who come for Fajr every day in the masjid, and they're not on this flight. There are people who, are consistent in giving sadaqah, and they're not on this flight. And there are people who wake up for tahajjud every morning, and they're not being pulled in the way that I'm being pulled to Allah's home. If it should have been that I would have to perform X amount of deeds in order to now be pulled at such a speed. And yet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is taking me now to His home, and He's pulling me whether I like it or not. It's very deep. It's very deep. And we should think about how little the effort is that's going into this as well. It used to be that if a person wanted to visit the Haram, they would have to travel walking for 6 months in order to visit. And then 6 months in order to come back. Just 50 years ago, if someone wanted to go from the subcontinent, it would take weeks or maybe months by ship that are plagued with disease, and people are literally on top of each other, and they would have to come and then they would land in Jeddah. And when they'd land in Jeddah, they were required to quarantine there for 3 days before they could even get off of the ship. And then they would have to travel by foot from Jeddah to Mecca, and that would be in extreme heat up and down mountains. This would take weeks for them to come. And Allah Ta'ala has made it so easy. I'm sitting in an air-conditioned airport, in an air-conditioned plane, and I'm getting there in a matter of 12 or 13 or 14 hours. How amazing it is. How amazing it is that this trip has become so easy in this day and age, and that this is despite the fact that we as an ummah have turned more away from the Prophet ﷺ than we have before. It should have been the opposite. The routes to Mecca and Medina should have become more difficult with the passing of time. It should have been more difficult for us to come because the lovers of Allah and the Prophet used to go before. And yet, the complete opposite has happened. We've distanced ourselves from Allah, yet His path for us to come to His haram has become so easy today. So this is a moment of reflection for us on this flight. This is a time of reflection for us. It's a highly spiritual time, especially when everyone's asleep on the plane. We should rest, but use this time to just close our eyes and cry before Allah Ta'ala that this is actually happening. Okay, the transition now. We're going to talk about the Umrah itself. And I mentioned to you that the Umrah itself is performed in the Haram of Makkah. These are the 4 main steps of the Umrah. And the first step of this, look, Umrah is very simple, right? You enter Ihram, do Tawaf, Sa'i, and then you trim your hair. The first step is going to be entering Ihram.